The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the quiet town of Mason Hill, Georgia. Streets glistened from the rain earlier that day, and the scent of wet earth still lingered in the breeze. Officer Brad Keller was driving slowly down Pinecrest Avenue, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near his radio. It was a routine patrol, another slow day in a town that rarely made headlines. Then he saw him. An old black man, dressed in a worn military-style coat, was walking alone near Mason Park, his gait steady but labored, his back slightly hunched as if years of carrying burdens had pressed his spine into submission. His beard was white, thick, and unkempt. In one hand he carried a duffel bag that had seen better decades. Brad narrowed his eyes. He slowed the cruiser to a crawl and flicked the siren once, just a brief chirp. The old man turned, calm and unhurried. His eyes were gentle but unwavering, like the gaze of someone who had learned long ago not to be startled by flashing lights or loud voices. "Sir, I need you to stop right there," Brad called out as he stepped out of the cruiser, hand instinctively near his holster. The old man complied. He stood still on the sidewalk, duffel bag resting at his feet. "Where you headed?" Brad asked, tone sharp. "Just walking," the man replied. His voice was deep, slow, and firm. "Stretching my legs before sunset." "You from around here?" "Born and raised. Mason Hill High. Class of '62. Brad didn't lower his tone. "What's in the bag?" "Some groceries. A few books. You can check if you'd like." Brad didn't wait for permission. He approached, grabbed the duffel, and yanked it open. Inside were a loaf of bread, canned beans, a folded newspaper, and a small framed photo. A young man in military uniform smiled out from behind glass. "You got ID?" The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as if trying to avoid being misunderstood. Brad snatched it from him and examined the driver's license. Elijah Booker. No warrants, no priors. Still, Brad wasn't satisfied. "You're loitering in a park after hours. That's suspicious." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "The park closes at 9. It's barely 6. Brad ignored him. "Turn around." Hands on the cruiser. "Officer, with respect." I said turn around. The street was nearly empty. But across the road, a teenage girl standing on her porch began recording on her phone. Brad shoved Elijah toward the cruiser. Hands rough, voice raised. "You people think you can walk anywhere and no one will question it?" Elijah didn't resist. He stared straight ahead, lips tight, heart quiet. He had seen worse, but the camera caught everything. By the next morning, the video had amassed over 2 million views on TikTok. The caption read simply, "Black war vet harassed in Georgia." Again, hashtags flooded in. Hashtag racist cop. Hashtag justice for Elijah. Hashtag still fighting. Cable news stations played the clip on loop. Commentators dissecting every second. Civil rights leaders called for action. Local activists demanded that Brad Keller be fired. The mayor released a statement saying the matter would be reviewed with urgency. The police department announced Brad was on paid administrative leave pending investigation. The internet did what it did best. It began digging. Who was Elijah Booker? Where had he come from? Why hadn't he fought back? But there were no interviews. No statements from him. No social media profiles to stalk. He remained a mystery, cloaked in silence. Meanwhile, Brad sat in his apartment watching the same clip on his television. Fingers clenched, heart pounding. The voice of his father, a retired officer, echoed in his head. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." But even he wasn't sure anymore. He dealt with tough calls, made arrests in worse neighborhoods. But nothing had ever followed him home like this. He started receiving messages on Facebook, some defending him, but most filled with rage and disgust. His tires were slashed one morning. The mailbox outside his apartment complex burned. He stopped leaving home. He drank more. He stared at the badge on his desk, and for the first time, it didn't feel like protection, it felt like evidence. Elijah Booker sat in his modest home on the edge of town, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan as it fought off the heat. The world outside was on fire with his name, but inside, everything was still. His house was humble, an old wooden porch with a creaky swing. Walls lined with faded photographs, some in color, most in black and white. There were no medals on display, no flags, no uniforms, He'd packed all those away years ago. He hadn't asked for this spotlight. He hadn't wanted pity, rage, or apologies. He wanted peace. The knock on the door was soft. He opened it to see a woman in her 30s. Professional and poised, holding a briefcase. "My name is Myra James," she said, "civil rights attorney. I'm here on behalf of the Georgia Justice Coalition. We'd like to represent you. Pro bono." Elijah shook his head. "I'm not looking to sue anyone. Ma'am, it's not just about you. Mr. Booker, it's about the pattern, the injustice." "Sometimes," Elijah said, "silence makes more noise." Myra frowned. "They'll sweep this under the rug. Like they always do." "Maybe," he said, voice calm, "but I've lived long enough to know that not every battle is fought with noise. Sometimes, you wait, and you pick the right moment." She left her card anyway. Elijah closed the door, walked back to the kitchen, and opened a drawer. Inside was an old, tattered folder. He touched it gently but didn't open it yet. Outside, reporters waited in vans. He drew the curtains and sat back down. The silence didn't bother him. He had lived through war. This was just another kind of battlefield. Brad Keller sat in the precinct's empty locker room, staring at the beige metal door of his locker. The badge was gone from his chest, locked away in a drawer. His gun too. The department hadn't fired him yet, but the sting of being removed from active duty cut deeper than he expected. His partner, Davis, had stopped answering texts. Other officers gave him polite nods and nothing more. Even the new recruits looked at him differently, some with disdain, others with fear, like his proximity might infect them. The department issued a statement. "We are committed to upholding justice for all citizens of Mason Hill." That was it. No defense, no explanation, just a line in a press release that threw him under the bus. He tried talking to his father. Retired Chief Hal Keller still held sway in town. But Hal's voice had changed. "Son, it's a different world now. We don't get to run it like we used to." "Run it?" Brad repeated. His father exhaled. "You let your emotions show. That's what they caught. Doesn't matter what the man did or didn't do. You gave them the image they needed. So I'm the villain now?" Hal looked away. "You made yourself the villain." Brad felt like screaming. Instead, he drove, late at night. Nowhere in mind. He passed the park, the same spot where it all began. Yellowed grass under dim lights. The silence mocked him. In the back of his mind, a question whispered louder than the noise. What if they're right? But he wasn't ready to answer that. Not yet. The night was quiet in Elijah Booker's home. But inside his mind, storms raged. He sat alone in his study, a dim lamp casting warm light over the wooden desk scarred by time. In his hands, the old folder he'd once refused to open now lay unlocked. Its contents spread out like fragments of a forgotten war. Faded photographs, yellowed commendation letters, a torn field map with blood smeared in one corner, a telegram from 1969, informing his mother of his field promotion to captain, and a Bronze Star citation signed by a president long dead. He picked up a photograph, 3 young black men in uniform, standing beside a white lieutenant in the muddy jungles of Vietnam. Elijah was at the center, his arms slung over the shoulder of a friend who would never come home. He touched the image with reverence, as if the paper itself still carried their voices. He remembered the heat, the way the mosquitoes swarmed under the helmet, the smell of cordite and burning rice paddies. He remembered the looks from some of his fellow soldiers, the way they'd flinch when he gave orders, even when he outranked them. He remembered being called boy by a private fresh out of Arkansas. But he also remembered the ones who stood with him, who bled beside him, who saluted him not because they were forced to, but because he had earned it. One night in '72, during a rescue operation gone sideways, he carried a wounded white sergeant 3 miles through enemy territory. The man lived, never said thank you, but years later, Elijah received a letter from the sergeant's son, thanking the man who saved his father's life. That letter was in the folder too, smudged with old fingerprints. Elijah stared out the window at the night sky. The stars hadn't changed, but the country had, or at least it claimed to. He whispered under his breath, "They remember me when I'm in uniform. Forget me when I'm in line at the grocery store." And yet, he did not feel anger. Not anymore, only a weary kind of sorrow. Like a man who has been fighting so long that peace feels like a stranger. When Myra James received Elijah's call, She nearly dropped her phone. It was barely dawn, and her apartment was still half dark. She scrambled to grab a notepad. Just in case. I've reconsidered, Elijah said simply. You might want to come by. She arrived at his home that afternoon. Elijah handed her the folder without a word and watched her reactions unfold like waves. She flipped through the documents in disbelief, each page painting a more vivid picture than the last. This is monumental. She breathed, touching the Medal of Honor citation with reverence. Why didn't you tell anyone? I didn't think I needed to, Elijah said. I thought my country already knew. But they don't, and they need to. Mr. Booker, the fact that someone like you was treated the way you were, on camera, in public, this can't go unchallenged. This could change everything. Elijah gave her a long, measured look. Myra, you need to be sure. If you do this, it's not just a legal battle. It's personal. For them. For you. She nodded. I was born for this. That evening, Myra held a press conference outside the courthouse. Cameras lined the sidewalk. Microphones perched like vultures. Behind her, she held up a framed photograph of Elijah in uniform. She spoke clearly, powerfully. 3 days ago, America watched a decorated war hero, a man who served his country with distinction, be degraded and humiliated on the streets of his own hometown. This is not just about one officer. It is about all the silent systems that enable this behavior. We are not only demanding justice, we are demanding memory. The internet exploded once more. The name Elijah Booker shot to trending on Twitter. The folder, now scanned and uploaded, became public. Veterans across the country shared their own experiences of post-service neglect. Politicians scrambled to comment. The president's office released a statement recognizing Booker's service. And at the heart of it all, Elijah sat quietly on his porch, watching clouds drift across the sky. Unmoved by fame, unshaken by attention, the fury descended on Mason Hill like a summer thunderstorm. And in the eye of the storm stood Officer Brad Keller. Bewildered, exhausted, and suddenly, painfully visible. Protesters lined the steps of City Hall. They carried signs with Elijah's photo beneath captions like, "Still a soldier. Still a target." Local businesses displayed his face in their windows. A mural began to form on a brick wall near the park, the very spot where he had been stopped. Young artists painted his profile beneath an American flag, with the words, "Remember him." Brad was summoned for questioning by Internal Affairs. The questions came fast and cold. Were you aware of Mr. Booker's identity during the stop? No. Would your behavior have changed if you had known? I don't know. The officers exchanged glances. Brad left the room pale, sweat staining his collar. The department announced a disciplinary hearing would take place within the week. His badge was officially suspended. Protesters gathered outside the police station daily, chanting his name with venom. At home, his phone buzzed constantly. Journalists, family, old friends, even his father stopped answering his calls. He drove to the outskirts of town one night and sat in silence. Engine off, windows down, watching the moon rise. He didn't know if he was angry or ashamed. Both, maybe, or neither. Mostly, he felt lost. At a gas station, a young black boy no older than 12 stared at him with a mix of fear and defiance. Brad turned away. He couldn't even face a child. The mayor of Mason Hill, under mounting pressure, orchestrated a public apology event. It was held at the Civic Center, surrounded by news vans, civil rights leaders, and veterans of all backgrounds. Elijah Booker was escorted to the stage by 2 fellow soldiers, both black, both long retired. The room fell silent when he entered. Cameras clicked. People stood. Brad Keller sat backstage, palms sweating, throat dry. He hadn't seen Elijah since that day in the park. Now, as he peeked from behind the curtain, he saw not an old man, but a mountain cloaked in humility. The mayor gave a speech full of carefully chosen words. Then Brad was summoned. He walked onto the stage to a mixture of boos and silence. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. I want to say that I was wrong. That I acted out of suspicion, not fact. That I let my assumptions dictate my actions. And I'm sorry. To Mr. Booker, to the town, to everyone watching. He turned to Elijah, who stood quietly, unreadable. I didn't know who you were. Brad continued, voice breaking. But that's the problem, isn't it? Elijah stepped forward. He didn't shake Brad's hand. Instead, He leaned toward the microphone and spoke gently. "You didn't know who I was. But I did." He turned to the crowd. "And I still do." Then he stepped down, leaving Brad standing alone beneath the glare of spotlights and judgment. Outside, the chants began again. But something was changing. Because for the first time, Brad Keller wasn't defending himself. He was listening. Long after the lights of the Civic Center had faded, Elijah Booker sat in his bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan rotating slowly above him. Outside, the world was roaring in his name. News anchors called him a hero. Hashtags turned him into a symbol. Journalists begged for interviews. And yet, within the stillness of his home, Elijah felt only the rising weight of something he thought he had buried long ago. Sleep came to him in fragments, short, violent bursts of rest interrupted by the ghosts of the jungle. He dreamed of gunfire echoing through banana trees, the burning smell of napalm, the metallic taste of blood. He saw faces, young boys from Mississippi, Detroit, Alabama, faces black and white, yelling through the chaos. He heard the screams again, the last breath of Corporal James Wallace as he bled out in Elijah's arms. In the dream, Elijah screamed too, but no one heard. He woke drenched in sweat, clutching the edges of the mattress as if holding onto the present would keep the past at bay. He got up, walked into the hallway, and stood before the large mirror outside his bathroom. The man staring back was a stranger, older, more weathered. There were lines in his face he hadn't seen before, cracks in the armor he had so carefully built over decades. He had told himself that silence was strength, that dignity was found in restraint, that he had nothing left to prove. But watching Brad Keller stumble through that apology, seeing the boy behind the badge rather than the monster painted by the media, Elijah was struck by something unexpected: pity. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down at his kitchen table. The folder still lay open beside his cup of coffee from earlier that morning. His life, reduced to paper. He wondered, for the first time in years, if silence had been a shield or a prison. Maybe it was time to speak. Not for himself, but for the voices long buried beside muddy foxholes. Names carved on black granite walls in Washington. Or bodies forgotten in unmarked graves overseas. Maybe this fight was not yet over. Brad Keller hadn't been back to the precinct since the apology event. His suspension had been extended indefinitely. Officially, he was still employed. Unofficially, he was radioactive. He stayed in his apartment most days, blinds drawn, pacing the floor like a caged animal. He watched every video, every news segment, every debate about Elijah Booker. But the worst wasn't what others said. It was what he began to say to himself. He started remembering things, old calls, traffic stops, brief moments of interaction that suddenly glared in hindsight. He remembered the black teen he once pulled over for driving suspiciously slow. The mother who asked for help and was met with impatience. The boy in the hoodie who had looked afraid. But Brad assumed guilt. There was a pattern he had never seen because he had never looked. One night, he visited the Mason Hill Public Library. It was nearly closing time. He walked in, hoodie pulled over his head. Avoiding eye contact, he made his way to the community record section and typed in, Elijah Booker. The screen lit up with articles, some dating back to the 1970s. Awards, interviews, a mention in a military journal, an op-ed he wrote once titled, When the Uniform Comes Off. Brad read it 3 times. It said, they respect the man I was, but not the man I am. They salute my past, but ignore my present. I have served, bled, and survived, but I am still, in their eyes, expendable. Brad shut the computer. He walked home in silence, replaying those words over and over. The floor beneath his worldview had begun to crack, and he wasn't sure what would rise from the rubble. The Georgia Veterans Association announced a statewide event to honor Elijah Booker's service. They called it the Legacy Salute. It would take place on the steps of the Capitol building in Atlanta. Dignitaries from across the country would attend. A presidential envoy would speak. Elijah would be given the Medal of Valor, the highest honor awarded by the state. When Myra James told Elijah about the plan, he looked away and chuckled softly. I'm too old for parades, he said. But it's not just for you, Myra insisted. It's for every black veteran who never got a parade. Every forgotten name. Elijah nodded slowly. He understood. The day arrived beneath clear skies. The Capitol steps were draped in red, white, and blue. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, many in uniform, some in wheelchairs, some missing limbs, all saluting a man who had, until recently, walked among them invisible. Elijah stepped up to the podium, his gait slow but proud. He wore a tailored suit with polished shoes. No medals pinned to his chest, just a small American flag on his lapel. The crowd fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. "I stand here not as a hero," he began, but as a reminder. He paused, letting the words breathe. "For too long, men who looked like me fought wars for a country that waged war against them at home. We were brave on the battlefield, but suspected in the streets. We bled for freedom and were denied its simplest form, dignity." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I have spent most of my life not asking for praise. I did my duty. I loved this country, even when it did not love me back. And I still do. But love, like country, must evolve." He looked directly at the cameras. "To those who watched me be humiliated, thank you, for not looking away. To those who stood up, spoke out, marched, thank you, for showing that silence is no longer acceptable. And to those who still wear the badge, I ask you, know who you serve, and see them." He stepped back. The applause was thunderous. Tears flowed freely. That evening, as the sun set behind the Capitol dome, Elijah stood at the top of the steps, watching children wave flags, old men tip their hats, and strangers reach for his hand. He had not asked for this moment, but it had come. The ceremony ignited a fire across the country. News stations ran Elijah's speech for days. Talk shows invited veterans of color to share their stories. Schools requested Elijah's permission to include his words in textbooks. A petition to designate April 15 as Colonel Booker Day in Georgia reached over 1 million signatures. But something deeper stirred beneath the surface. In classrooms, students debated systemic bias for the first time. Churches held community forums. Police departments in multiple cities began re-evaluating their training modules. Books about black military history flew off shelves. And in Mason Hill, something remarkable happened. The mural of Elijah at the park was completed, now stretching over 2 stories high. Below it, an inscription carved into stone read, "The man they couldn't erase." Children played beneath it, chasing each other on scooters and bikes, laughing in the shadow of his likeness. A group of young black teens formed an after-school club called the Bookers. Their mission was simple: service, honor, discipline. They wrote letters to veterans. They interviewed elders in the neighborhood. They held mock trials about justice and ethics. And Elijah, now a household name, turned down every network interview. Instead, he spent his mornings at the community center, teaching chess to kids and telling them stories not of war, but of peace. One day, a boy asked him, "Do you forgive that cop?" Elijah smiled gently. "Forgiveness is a journey. Some roads take longer to walk. But I'm headed in that direction." The boy nodded, like he understood. And so, the town that once looked away now looked inward. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. And that, Elijah thought, was a good start. The mirror in Brad Keller's hallway had become a daily ritual, a confrontation. Each morning, he stood before it, brushing his teeth, fixing his hair, straightening the collar of a shirt he no longer wore for duty. But more and more, the man in the reflection seemed like a stranger. The town had changed, but so had he, and not in the way he'd expected. He had been attending the mandatory re-education workshops quietly ordered by the police commission. Diversity training, community engagement modules, empathy building exercises. On paper, it sounded performative, but the facilitator, a retired police officer turned educator named Malcolm Reyes, made it real, brutally real. "I was you," Malcolm said on the first day, standing before a room full of suspended or reprimanded officers. "And if you're here, chances are you still don't think you've done anything wrong. Let's fix that." Brad wanted to tune it out, but he couldn't, not when Malcolm walked them through body cam footage of unnecessary stops, psychological research on implicit bias, and heartbreaking stories of children growing up terrified of the very people meant to protect them. Brad watched as others flinched, denied, argued, but he sat still, absorbing every word like slow dripping acid. He began having dreams, not nightmares, but quiet, haunting scenes. A memory of a traffic stop where he mocked a father in front of his crying son. Another time when he searched a teen's backpack without cause. Just because something felt off. They replayed in the dark like a reel of evidence. He started journaling, scribbling questions he couldn't answer. When did I stop listening? Who taught me this lens? Am I still salvageable? The questions deepened when he visited his father in hospice. Hal Keller lay frail and pale in a hospital bed, oxygen hissing beside him. Brad hadn't seen him in weeks. They spoke in short, bitter bursts until Hal, between wheezes, said something that clung to Brad like a thorn. "You're doing all this soul-searching crap," the old man muttered, "but at the end of the day, son, you're still a Keller. We don't kneel." Brad stared at him, unmoving. Maybe that's the problem. He left without saying goodbye. It was a Tuesday morning when Elijah Booker received the invitation from Mason Hill High School. The history teacher, Ms. Ramirez, wrote him a letter, not an email. Not a call, but an old-fashioned, handwritten letter, requesting his presence to speak to her civics class. She wrote, "They're tired of lectures. They want to meet a man who made history. Not just studied it." Elijah chuckled to himself. "History," he muttered. "I suppose I qualify." The next week, he walked into the classroom to a standing ovation from 30 teenagers. Some had phones out, filming. Others just stared, wide-eyed, as if a living statue had stepped down from a war memorial and into their fluorescent-lit world. He didn't use notes, didn't rehearse, he just talked. He told them about growing up during segregation, about drinking from colored-only fountains and dodging spitballs on the school bus. He spoke about being 17 and lying about his age to enlist. About his first time holding a rifle. About the first time he had to use it. He didn't glamorize war. He told them about the heat, the fear, the silence after explosions. About the way you forget your name when you're screaming someone else's. About the friends who didn't make it home and the guilt of being one of the few who did. Then he told them about coming back. No parades, no medals waiting at the airport. Just suspicion. Doors that stayed closed. Eyes that looked through me. One student raised a hand. "Do you hate the country?" Elijah paused. "No, but I hate the parts of it that still hate me." Another asked, "If you could go back, would you still serve?" He smiled. "Yes, because I wasn't fighting for a perfect country. I was fighting for the possibility of one." When the bell rang, no one moved. Ms. Ramirez had to gently remind them to head to their next class. One boy stayed behind. "Mr. Booker," he said softly, "how do you forgive people who try to break you?" Elijah put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You forgive them," he said, "not because they deserve it, but because you do." The old man was dying. And for the first time in his life, Brad Keller wasn't sure what to say to his father. Hal had built his reputation in Mason Hill as a straight-talking, no-nonsense officer, the kind of man people either respected or feared. For Brad, growing up had meant long shadows and unspoken rules. Never cry, never admit fault, always defend your own. But now Hal was a skeleton of that man, flesh thinning, voice raspy, the hospital gown swallowing what remained of his pride. Brad sat beside the bed, watching his father sleep. The sound of the heart monitor was steady. A nurse passed by, nodded politely, and left them alone. Hal stirred. His eyes blinked open, glazed but aware. "You came back," he whispered. Brad nodded. "Yeah." They were quiet a long time. "I saw the news," Hal said. "The speech, the apology." Brad waited for judgment, but it didn't come. "I hated it," Hal admitted, "but I saw something in you I never had in me." Brad raised an eyebrow. "Shame," Hal said, coughing. "Real shame. The kind that changes you." Brad looked away. "I was wrong, son," Hal said. "I taught you the wrong things. I passed on my anger like a family heirloom. And I watched you carry it like it was a damn badge." Brad's eyes welled. "Why didn't you say that sooner?" "Because I thought it made me strong," Hal murmured. "But I was just scared. Scared they'd see me as weak. Scared to admit I'd become the thing I swore to protect people from." Silence hung between them. "I'm sorry, Dad," Brad said. Hal closed his eyes. "Don't be sorry. Be better." That night, when Hal passed in his sleep, Brad was still in the room, holding his hand. Not out of obligation, but as a final, quiet act of redemption. Myra James had spent months building her case. Stacks of documents, deposition requests, interview transcripts. It had grown into something far bigger than one incident in a park. It was now a lawsuit against the city itself. Elijah Booker versus Mason Hill. Alleging systemic racial bias, police misconduct, and civil rights violations. The courtroom was packed when it began, journalists, citizens, activists, and off-duty cops, all watching every word. The city attorneys argued procedural defense, trying to distance themselves from Brad's actions. They claimed it was an isolated incident. Myra, steady as steel, countered with years of internal records, patterns of complaint dismissals, racially skewed stop and search data. Then came Elijah's turn to testify. He walked to the stand in a dark suit. No medals, no entourage. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and sat down. He told the truth, not just about the day Brad stopped him, but about the lifetime that led to that moment. He spoke of forgotten soldiers, of empty promises, of a justice system that kept receipts for every sin but lost records of honor. "I don't want vengeance," he said, looking directly at the judge. "I want acknowledgement, I want change, and I want to know that the country I fought for will fight for me now." When the verdict came weeks later, it was unanimous. The city was liable. A multi-million-dollar settlement was awarded, but Elijah declined to keep a cent. Every dollar went to fund a new civic initiative, the Booker Reform Act, which included community liaisons, bias training, a citizens review board, and school-based outreach programs about equity and justice. The mayor signed it into law on live television. Standing beside her was Elijah. And beside him, unexpected, but welcomed, was Brad Keller. Not as an officer, but as a man learning how to serve again. The morning was cool, with a crisp breeze rustling the trees around Mason Park, the place where everything began. Elijah Booker sat on the same weathered bench where he had once been detained. The faded duffel bag at his side now replaced with a leather-bound notebook. He watched children run by, heard a distant whistle from a basketball game, and smelled barbecue drifting from a nearby house. Footsteps approached from behind, slow, hesitant. Brad Keller stopped a few feet away. Elijah looked up, his face calm. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, closing the notebook. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Brad replied, "but I figured this was as good a place as any." They sat in silence for a while, watching the world move on around them. "You walk much these days?" Brad asked awkwardly. "Every morning," Elijah said. "Gives the knees something to do besides ache." Brad nodded. "Mind if I join you?" Elijah hesitated, then stood. "Let's walk." They moved side by side along the concrete path, past the mural where Elijah's face gazed back with solemn dignity. A young girl on a bike passed them and waved. Elijah waved back. Brad didn't. Brad finally spoke. "I keep going over that day in my head. 100 times. I replay it, looking for a way to undo it." "You can't," Elijah said gently. "None of us can undo our worst days. We just try not to repeat them." Brad lowered his gaze. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it." "You're asking the wrong question," Elijah replied. "It's not about what you deserve. It's about what you do next." They stopped at the edge of the park. A plaque beneath the mural read, "Honor is not just given. It is remembered." Brad turned to Elijah. "I want to help, however I can. I don't want to hide behind apologies anymore." Elijah studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "There's work to be done." That was the beginning of something neither of them had expected: partnership. Not as symbols, but as men, walking forward together. The community center buzzed with energy. Teenagers rehearsed poetry. Veterans drank coffee over checkers. Volunteers sorted clothes in a donation room marked, "For those who served and still struggle." In the back wing of the building was a new space, clean walls, soft lighting, and a sign that read, "The Colonel's Path, a Center for Justice, Memory, and Renewal." The project had started as an idea scribbled in one of Elijah's old notebooks. A space where people could come not just to remember the past, but to reshape the future. Elijah was reluctant to be the face of anything, but Brad insisted, this wasn't about ego. It was about giving purpose to pain. The center offered history workshops, trauma healing circles, legal aid, and civic education programs. Brad ran the logistics. Elijah met with youth groups and led story sessions for local schools. One afternoon, a boy approached Brad after a workshop. He was tall, maybe 15, with headphones hanging around his neck and a notebook stuffed in his hoodie. "You're that cop, right?" the boy asked. Brad tensed but nodded. "I heard what happened," the boy said. "What you did? I'm not proud of it." The boy shrugged. "Maybe that's the point. My uncle got beat up by cops last year. Didn't even file a report. Said it wouldn't matter." Brad crouched down a little to meet the boy's eyes. "It matters. It should. And if you ever want to talk about it, or anything, you've got a place here." The boy paused, then extended a fist. Brad bumped it, and the boy walked away. Inside, Elijah had been watching. Later that night, the two men sat under the porch light, the quiet between them as comfortable as old friends. "You're good with them," Elijah said. Brad chuckled. "Takes one to save one." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Don't flatter yourself." They both laughed. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about responsibility. The sky was overcast on Memorial Day, but the streets of Mason Hill were brighter than ever. Flags lined the sidewalks, and the old courthouse square had been transformed into a field of remembrance. Hundreds gathered, veterans in uniform, children in scout sashes, townspeople with hand-stitched banners. The stage at the front bore one name above all: Colonel Elijah Booker. He sat quietly in the front row, flanked by community leaders, Myra James, and Brad. His suit was pressed, his shoes gleamed, but he looked smaller than usual. A little slower getting out of his seat when they called his name. He approached the podium one last time. "I've stood behind a podium in many places," Elijah began. "Some of them were sandbags. Some were jungles. Some were stages like this." He scanned the crowd. "Today isn't just about remembering the fallen. It's about remembering why they fell, so that the ones left standing can build something better." He took a breath. "When I first put on my uniform, I believed in an America that didn't yet exist for men like me. But I fought anyway, because I believed someday it could." There was no need for more words. The silence after his speech was reverent, unshakable. Then the applause came, rising and rising, until people stood, not because they were told to, but because their hearts demanded it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Elijah sat beneath the mural at the park. A small crowd gathered, not for a speech, but to listen as he read names from a list. Names of soldiers, friends, brothers. And when he finished, he placed the list in a small time capsule beside the mural and sealed it shut. Brad stood beside him, hand resting on his shoulder. "You okay?" Elijah nodded. "I am now." Years passed quietly, like the slow turning of pages in a well-worn book. Elijah Booker passed away on a September morning, just as the first leaves began to fall. He was 91. The cause was natural, the timing, poetic. The town mourned like it had lost a monument. A national memorial service was held at Arlington, attended by senators, generals, presidents past and present, but Mason Hill's service, held in the park where everything began, was the one that mattered most. Thousands came. Veterans traveled cross-country to salute one last time. Former students, now teachers, brought their children to say goodbye. Even those who had never met Elijah came, drawn by the gravity of a life lived with courage and quiet conviction. Brad gave the final eulogy. He stood before the crowd, no longer in uniform, no longer ashamed of his past, but not shackled by it either. "I met Colonel Elijah Booker on the worst day of my life," he began, "and somehow, he turned that day into the beginning of my second chance. He told stories, shared memories, laughed through tears. He taught me that justice isn't a destination. It's a path, and it's one we have to walk every single day." After the service, a bronze statue was unveiled, a likeness of Elijah. Not in combat gear, but in a suit, sitting on a bench, hands clasped, gaze lifted toward the future. At the base, an inscription read, "He fought, he forgave, he showed us the way." That night, Brad sat alone under the stars. He held the worn notebook Elijah had left him, filled with sketches, quotes, thoughts, and one final message written on the last page. "Keep walking, Brad. Someone's watching. Teach them better than we were taught." Brad smiled through the ache in his chest. And the next morning, he did exactly that.